They say revenge is a dish best served cold. Well, let me tell you something, I've been letting mine freeze for 3 long years, and when I finally served it, it was colder than the marble floors of the mansion I once called home. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I lost, what I endured, and what I took back when everyone thought I was finished. But before I tell you how I destroyed my own daughter to reclaim what was rightfully mine, let me paint you a picture of what my life used to be. 23 years ago, I married into the Blackwood family, old money, old power, old secrets. I was 26 then, beautiful in that way that photographs well at charity galas. With honey blonde hair that caught the light just right and a smile that could make board members write bigger checks. If you're enjoying this story of betrayal and revenge, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The Blackwood estate sprawled across 47 acres of manicured perfection in Connecticut. The main house, God, how I loved that house, had been in the family for 4 generations. 18 rooms, each one decorated with pieces that cost more than most people's homes. The dining room alone could seat 24 people comfortably, with a chandelier that had been imported from Austria in 1892. I used to run my fingers along the crystal drops when no one was watching, marveling at how each one caught the afternoon sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. My husband Richard, may his soul rot wherever it ended up, was the heir apparent to the Blackwood fortune. His father, Harold Blackwood, controlled a portfolio worth over $200 million, real estate holdings across 3 states, a shipping company that had been in the family since the 1920s, and investments that generated more money in a month than most families see in a lifetime. When I married Richard, I thought I was marrying into security, into a world where I'd never have to worry about anything more serious than which designer gown to wear to the annual hospital fundraiser. But wealth comes with its own kind of poverty, doesn't it? I was rich in everything except the things that mattered. Richard treated me like another piece of expensive furniture, beautiful to look at, useful for entertaining guests, but ultimately replaceable if something better came along. His mother, Eleanor, never let me forget that I hadn't been their first choice for Richard's wife. She had her eye on the Patterson girl, Patricia Patterson, whose family owned half the textile mills in North Carolina. But Richard had chosen me, and Eleanor made sure I paid for that choice every single day for 23 years. The marriage produced 1 child, my daughter Sarah. She was born when I was 28. And for a brief, shining moment, I thought having a baby would change everything. I thought it would make Richard love me the way I'd seen him love his prize horses, with genuine affection and pride. Instead, Sarah became another way for him to show off his possessions. He hired the best nannies money could buy, enrolled her in the most exclusive private schools, and made sure she understood from an early age that she was a Blackwood first and my daughter second. I tried to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect daughter-in-law. I planned dinner parties that were featured in Connecticut magazine. I organized charity events that raised millions for causes I didn't really care about. I sat through countless board meetings as the smiling wife, nodding at the appropriate moments while men in expensive suits made decisions about money I'd never be allowed to touch. I wore the right clothes, said the right things, and smiled until my face ached, but perfection is exhausting, and after 15 years of it, I started to crack. I began drinking wine with lunch, just a glass or 2 to take the edge off the loneliness. I started spending more time in the estate's extensive library, losing myself in books about women who had more exciting lives than mine. I took up painting, thinking maybe I could find some kind of artistic fulfillment. But every canvas I touched seemed to reflect my own emptiness back at me. Richard barely noticed my slow descent into what I now recognize as depression. He was too busy with his business deals, his golf games, his hunting trips with other wealthy men who treated their wives like accessories. When he did notice me, it was usually to criticize something: my weight, my appearance at some social function, my failure to produce the son he'd always wanted. Sarah was beautiful and intelligent, but she wasn't the male heir who could carry on the Blackwood name in business. The distance between us grew so gradually that I didn't realize how far apart we'd drifted until it was too late to bridge the gap. We slept in separate bedrooms by the time Sarah turned 16. Richard claimed it was because of my restless sleeping, but I knew it was because he could barely stand to look at me anymore. I had become everything he despised: needy, emotional, and ordinary despite all the expensive trappings that surrounded me. Sarah, meanwhile, was growing into everything I had once been, but better. She was smarter than I'd ever been, more confident, more naturally suited to the world of wealth and power she'd been born into. Where I had always felt like an imposter at charity galas, Sarah commanded rooms from the time she was 18. She understood money in ways I never had, speaking fluently about investments and market trends that made my head spin. By the time she graduated from Harvard Business School, Richard was already grooming her to take over significant portions of the family business. I should have been proud. Any mother should have been proud of such an accomplished daughter. But all I could see was another person who belonged in the world where I had never quite fit. Sarah looked at me with the same barely concealed impatience that her father did, as if I were some unfortunate burden they had to carry. Family dinners became exercises in endurance, with Richard and Sarah discussing business while I sat at the far end of our dining table, picking at food I could no longer taste. The loneliness was crushing. I started taking longer walks around the estate, sometimes disappearing for hours at a time just to see if anyone would notice. They rarely did. I began having long conversations with Maria, our head housekeeper, simply because she was the only person who seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. She had worked for the Blackwood family for over 15 years, arriving from El Salvador when Sarah was just a toddler. Maria had warm brown eyes and gentle hands. And she never made me feel like I was taking up too much space in my own home. It was during one of these conversations, on a particularly lonely Tuesday afternoon in October, that Maria mentioned something that would change everything. We were in the sunroom, and I was helping her arrange fresh flowers, one of the few domestic tasks I was still allowed to perform without criticism. She was telling me about her daughter back in El Salvador. How proud she was that the girl was studying to be a teacher. When she suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said quietly, her voice different somehow. "There is something I think you should know." The way she said it made my blood turn cold. I set down the vase I was holding and looked at her directly. "What is it, Maria?" She glanced around the room as if checking for hidden listeners, then stepped closer to me. "It's about Mr. Richard." I didn't want to say anything, but I cannot keep quiet anymore. "It's not right what he's doing to you." My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "What do you mean?" Maria's face was full of sympathy and something else, anger, maybe. "The maid's room, Mrs. Blackwood. The small room behind the kitchen, where we sometimes store linens. He's been using it to meet with women. Different women, over the years. I've seen them come and go through the service entrance when you're out at your charity meetings." The world tilted sideways. I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself, feeling like I might vomit right there among the carefully arranged chrysanthemums. "How long?" I whispered. "Years," she said, and her voice was barely audible. "Many years. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Blackwood. I wanted to tell you before, but I was afraid. Afraid of losing my job, afraid of what might happen to my family if Mr. Richard found out I knew." I stood there in that beautiful sunroom, surrounded by flowers that cost more than Maria made in a month, and felt something inside me break completely. Not just my heart, that had been broken for years. Something deeper, something that had been holding me together despite everything. The last shred of dignity I'd been clinging to just disappeared, but with that breaking came something else. Something cold and sharp and infinitely more dangerous than the sad, lonely woman I'd been just moments before. Rage. Pure. Crystalline rage that cut through the numbness I'd been living in for years. "Show me," I said. Maria's eyes went wide. "Mrs. Blackwood, I don't think." "Show me," I repeated, and my voice was steadier than it had been in years. We walked through the house like conspirators, taking the servants' stairs down to the kitchen area. The maid's room was tucked away behind the main kitchen, originally designed as quarters for live-in help back when the house was first built. The Blackwoods hadn't employed live-in staff for decades, so the room had been converted into storage space. Or so I had thought. Maria produced a key from her pocket and unlocked the door. Inside, I found a room that had been transformed into something completely different from the storage space I remembered. There was a small but expensive-looking sofa, silk curtains on the windows, and a side table with crystal glasses and a bottle of aged whiskey. The kind of whiskey Richard saved for special occasions, but what destroyed me completely was the photograph sitting on that side table. It was a picture of Richard with a woman I recognized, Margaret Henderson, the wife of one of his business partners. They were embracing on what looked like a tropical beach, both of them laughing and tan and looking happier than I'd seen Richard look in years. There were other photos tucked behind it, other women, other trips I'd never known about. I picked up that photograph with trembling hands and stared at it until the faces blurred. 23 years of marriage, 23 years of trying to be perfect, of swallowing my pride and my needs and my dreams, and this was what I had to show for it. A husband who found me so repulsive that he'd rather sneak around with other men's wives than spend 5 minutes alone with me. Tell me where you're watching this from. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to know where in the world people understand the kind of betrayal I'm talking about. "Mrs. Blackwood?" Maria's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" I wasn't all right. I would never be all right again. But I was awake for the first time in years, fully and completely awake. And I knew exactly what I had to do. "Maria," I said, still staring at that photograph, "I need you to help me document everything in this room. Every photograph, every piece of evidence. Can you do that?" She nodded, understanding immediately what I was asking. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood. I can do that." We spent the next 2 hours carefully photographing everything, making sure to capture not just the evidence of Richard's affairs, but also the receipts we found in the side table drawer, receipts for jewelry I'd never seen, for hotel rooms in cities I'd never visited with him, for restaurants where he'd taken other women while telling me he was working late. When we were finished, I locked that room back up and walked through my house with new eyes. Every beautiful thing I saw, the Persian rugs, the imported marble, the priceless artwork, suddenly looked different. None of it belonged to me. It never had. I was just another decoration, carefully maintained but ultimately expendable. That night, I sat in my lonely bedroom and planned my husband's destruction. But I wasn't just planning to hurt Richard. I was planning to reclaim everything I'd lost, everything I'd been denied, everything that should have been mine by right of 23 years of suffering. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 3 days after my discovery in the maid's room, Richard came home from what he claimed was a business trip to Chicago. He was in a particularly good mood, whistling as he sorted through the mail in his study. I watched him from the doorway, this man I'd once loved, and felt nothing but disgust. "Good trip?" I asked casually. He looked up, surprised to see me there. We'd barely spoken in months. "Yes, very productive. The Henderson merger is going to be quite lucrative." Henderson. Margaret Henderson's husband. The irony was so thick I could taste it. "I'm glad," I said. "Richard, could we talk? There's something important I need to discuss with you." He glanced at his watch, a Rolex I'd given him for our 10th anniversary, back when I still believed our marriage meant something. "Can it wait? I have some calls to make." "It's about our marriage," I said quietly. Something in my tone must have alarmed him, because he set down the mail and looked at me more carefully. "What about our marriage?" I walked into the study and closed the door behind me. The room smelled like leather and expensive cigars, masculine scents that had once comforted me but now made me feel claustrophobic. "I know about the maid's room, Richard. I know about Margaret Henderson, and the others." The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. For a moment, he just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Then his survival instincts kicked in, and I watched him transform from shocked husband to calculating businessman. "I don't know what you think you know," he said carefully. "But," I pulled out my phone and showed him one of the photographs Maria and I had taken. His face crumpled. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Long enough," I said. "The question now is what we're going to do about it." He straightened up, and I could see him putting on the mask he wore in boardrooms. "What do you want?" What did I want? I wanted 23 years of my life back. I wanted to feel beautiful and desired and valued. I wanted to matter to someone, anyone, the way I had never mattered to him. But since I couldn't have any of that, I decided to settle for something else entirely. "I want a divorce," I said. "A very generous divorce." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You'll get what the prenup specifies. Nothing more." The prenuptial agreement. God, how naive I'd been at 26, signing that document without really understanding what it meant. The Blackwood family lawyer had explained it as a formality, a way to protect the family assets in the unlikely event that our marriage didn't work out. I'd been so in love, so certain that we'd be together forever, that I'd signed it without even reading the fine print. The prenup was ironclad. In the event of divorce, I would receive a modest settlement, enough to live comfortably but not enough to embarrass the family with my reduced circumstances. I would have no claim to the family business, no ongoing support beyond the first 5 years, and absolutely no claim to the estate I'd called home for more than 2 decades. "The prenup was signed under false pretenses," I said. "You were already cheating when we got married, weren't you?" His silence was answer enough. "I have evidence, Richard. Photographs, receipts, witness testimony. I can prove that you entered into our marriage fraudulently, that you've been unfaithful for our entire relationship. A good lawyer could argue that the prenup is void." "You can't prove anything about the beginning of our marriage," he said. But I could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Maybe not," I admitted. "But I can prove what's been happening for the last 15 years. I can prove that you've been stealing money from the family accounts to pay for your affairs. I can prove that you've been using company resources for personal entertainment. I can make this very, very messy for you, Richard. Is that really what you want?" We stared at each other across his mahogany desk, two people who had once promised to love each other forever, now reduced to calculating adversaries. I could see him weighing his options, trying to figure out how much damage I could really do. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked finally. "I want 50% of everything," I said. "Half of your personal assets, half of your stake in the family business, half of this house. In exchange, I'll keep quiet about your affairs and give you an uncontested divorce." He laughed again, but this time there was some genuine amusement in it. 50%? Have you lost your mind? My father would cut me off completely before he'd let you walk away with half the family fortune. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you turned our marriage into a joke. I said. The negotiation that followed was brutal. Richard brought in lawyers, I brought in lawyers, and for 6 months we waged war through legal documents and depositions. The evidence I had was damaging but not quite damaging enough to void the prenup completely. Richard's lawyers argued that his personal failings didn't constitute fraud in the legal sense, and unfortunately, they were probably right. But I had underestimated my husband's weakness, and overestimated his intelligence. While we were fighting over the divorce settlement, Richard made a mistake that would cost him everything he'd ever valued. He told his father about the situation. Harold Blackwood was 83 years old and had spent his entire life building and protecting the family legacy. He was a man who valued discretion above all else, who had built his fortune partly on his reputation for integrity and reliability. The idea that his son had been conducting sordid affairs in the family home, using family money to wine and dine other men's wives, was more than he could tolerate. But what really infuriated Harold wasn't the affairs themselves. Wealthy men having mistresses was hardly uncommon in his social circle. What infuriated him was Richard's sloppiness. His willingness to create scandalous evidence that could be used against the family. "You're weak," Harold told his son during a family meeting that I wasn't invited to but heard about later through Sarah. "Weak and stupid. Bad enough that you couldn't keep your wife satisfied, but to leave evidence lying around like some amateur. It's disgraceful." Harold's solution was characteristically ruthless. Rather than fight a potentially damaging court battle, he restructured his will. Richard's inheritance was reduced to a trust fund that would provide him with a comfortable but not extravagant income for life. The bulk of the family fortune, the business, the properties, the investments, would go directly to Sarah when Harold died. Sarah, who was 28 at the time and had been working in the family business for 6 years, was elevated to president of Blackwood Holdings immediately. Richard, who had expected to inherit control of everything, found himself effectively demoted to a well-paid employee in his own family's company. The divorce settlement was finalized 3 months later. I received exactly what the prenup had specified, a modest payout and 5 years of support payments. It was enough to rent a small apartment in town and live quietly. But it was nothing compared to what I'd expected to gain from 23 years of marriage. Richard moved out of the family estate and into a condo in the city. He was still wealthy by most people's standards, but he was no longer the heir to a business empire. His affairs had cost him everything he'd spent his life working toward, and everyone in our social circle knew it. I should have been satisfied. I had exposed my husband's infidelity, destroyed his relationship with his father, and cost him his inheritance. By any reasonable measure, I had gotten my revenge, but I wasn't satisfied. I was alone in a tiny apartment, 49 years old with no real skills and no purpose, watching my daughter live the life I had always wanted. Sarah had it all: youth, beauty, intelligence, and now unlimited access to the Blackwood fortune. She was everything I had tried to be, except she was successful at it. The bitterness grew inside me like a cancer. I watched from my small apartment as Sarah transformed Blackwood Holdings into something even more profitable than it had been under Harold's leadership. I read about her in business magazines, saw her photograph in society columns, and felt my resentment deepen with every success she achieved. 2 years after the divorce, Harold Blackwood died in his sleep at the age of 85. Sarah inherited everything, becoming one of the wealthiest women in the state overnight. She was 30 years old, beautiful, brilliant, and worth over $300 million. I attended Harold's funeral in a black dress I'd bought at a department store, sitting in the back while Sarah accepted condolences from people who had once been my friends. Richard was there too, looking older and smaller than I remembered. His face gray with the knowledge that his father had died, still disappointed in him. After the service, Sarah approached me in the parking lot. She was composed and elegant in her grief, every inch the successful businesswoman she'd become. "Mother," she said formally. We hadn't spoken since the divorce proceedings began. "How are you?" "I'm fine, Elid. Congratulations on your inheritance." She studied my face for a moment, and I saw something that might have been pity in her eyes. "You know, the trust fund grandfather set up for you could be increased. If you need more support, I don't need your charity," I said, the words coming out harsher than I'd intended. "It's not charity," she said quietly. "It's family." But I was too proud and too bitter to accept help from the daughter who had everything I'd wanted. I turned and walked away from her, and from any chance of rebuilding our relationship. That night, alone in my apartment, I began planning my daughter's destruction. The plan took me 18 months to develop and another 2 years to execute. It was complex, requiring patience, cunning, and a willingness to sacrifice what little remained of my moral compass. But I had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The first phase involved research. I hired a private investigator, a discreet man named Thomas Kellerman who specialized in corporate intelligence. His job was to find any weakness in Sarah's management of Blackwood Holdings. Any decision that could be questioned, any relationship that could be exploited. What we discovered was that Sarah, for all her brilliance, had made one crucial mistake early in her tenure as president. She had entered into a partnership with a company called Meridian Development, using Blackwood Holdings assets as collateral for a massive real estate project in downtown Hartford. The project was ultimately successful, but the way the deal had been structured potentially violated the terms of Harold's will. Harold's will contained a clause requiring that any major business decisions be approved by a board of trustees, a safeguard he'd put in place to prevent exactly the kind of reckless speculation that Sarah had engaged in. Sarah had bypassed this requirement, arguing that the urgency of the deal made board approval impractical. It was a technicality, but it was enough. The second phase involved building a case. I spent my remaining divorce settlement hiring the best lawyers I could afford, building a legal argument that Sarah had violated the terms of her inheritance and should forfeit her control of the family business. It was a long shot, but precedent existed for such challenges, especially when large sums of money were involved. The third phase was the most difficult, because it required me to do something I'd never thought I was capable of. I had to destroy people I'd once cared about. Maria, the housekeeper who had helped me expose Richard's affairs, had become something of a friend over the years. She'd been the only person to show me genuine kindness during the darkest period of my life. But Maria had also been present for several conversations between Sarah and her business partners. Conversations that could be crucial to my legal case. I convinced Maria to testify on my behalf by threatening to report her immigration status to the authorities. It was a lie. Maria had been a legal resident for years, but she didn't know that. She agreed to testify that she had overheard Sarah discussing ways to circumvent Harold's wishes regarding the business. I manipulated other former friends and employees in similar ways, using secrets I'd learned during my years as Richard's wife to coerce them into supporting my case. I betrayed confidences, destroyed relationships, and used people's vulnerabilities against them, all in service of my plan to reclaim what I believed was rightfully mine. The legal battle began in earnest 3 years after Harold's death. My lawyers argued that Sarah had violated the terms of her inheritance by making major business decisions without proper authorization, and that control of Blackwood Holdings should therefore revert to the next heir in line, which, due to the complex terms of Harold's will, was actually me. Sarah's lawyers argued that the Meridian deal had been a legitimate business decision made in the best interests of the company, and that Harold's approval requirements had been meant for far larger transactions. They painted me as a bitter ex-wife trying to profit from legal technicalities. The case dragged on for 8 months. I spent every penny I had on legal fees, selling jewelry and furniture to pay my lawyers. I took out loans against my future support payments. I mortgaged my small apartment. Everything I owned went toward this one last gamble. Sarah, meanwhile, was forced to defend not just her inheritance but her reputation. The legal challenge made headlines in the business press, raising questions about her judgment and stability. Stock prices for companies that did business with Blackwood Holdings began to fluctuate as investors worried about the outcome of the case. The strain showed on both of us. I lost 20 pounds and developed a nervous tic in my left eye from stress and poor sleep. Sarah appeared increasingly haggard at court proceedings, the pressure of managing a business empire while fighting for her right to keep it clearly taking its toll. But Sarah had resources I couldn't match. Her legal team was larger, better funded, and more experienced. They systematically dismantled my case, proving that the Meridian deal had ultimately been profitable for Blackwood Holdings and arguing that Harold's will should be interpreted to support business decisions that benefited the company, not constrain them. More damaging to my case was their investigation into my methods of gathering evidence. They discovered my coercion of Maria and other witnesses, painting me as a desperate woman who had resorted to intimidation and blackmail to build her case. Several of my witnesses recanted their testimony when offered immunity from prosecution. The judge's final ruling was devastating. Not only did he reject my challenge to Sarah's inheritance, but he ordered me to pay Sarah's legal costs, a sum that exceeded $2 million. I was financially destroyed, facing bankruptcy and potential criminal charges for witness intimidation, but in the weeks that followed the ruling, something unexpected happened. Sarah, despite having every right to pursue the judgment against me, chose not to. She quietly arranged for the legal costs to be absorbed by Blackwood Holdings and made no attempt to collect the money I owed her. More surprisingly, she reached out to me directly for the first time since Harold's funeral. "Mother," she said when she called, "we need to talk." We met at a small cafe in town, neutral territory where neither of us held the advantage. Sarah looked exhausted but triumphant, like a general who had won a costly victory. I looked like exactly what I was, a defeated woman with nothing left to lose. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why did you do this to us?" I stared into my coffee cup, searching for an answer that would make sense to both of us. The truth was too complicated, too raw, too humiliating to explain. You had everything, I said finally. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd sacrificed for. And you got it all just by being born. You could have been part of it, Sarah said quietly. After grandfather died, I tried to include you. I offered to help you, to make sure you were taken care of. You rejected all of it. I didn't want your charity. It wasn't charity. It was love. The word hit me like a physical blow. Love. When was the last time anyone had said they loved me? When was the last time I'd felt worthy of love? I destroyed our family, I whispered. Yes, Sarah said, and her honesty was somehow more comforting than false reassurance would have been. You did. But maybe we can build something new. The reconciliation was slow and painful. Sarah paid off my debts and helped me find a small house on the edge of town, nothing grand but comfortable enough for a woman of my age. She offered me a position at Blackwood Holdings, administrative work, nothing important. But it gave me a purpose and a steady income. We had dinner together once a month. Stilted conversations where we both tried to navigate around the wreckage of our relationship. Sarah told me about her work, her hopes for the future, her complicated feelings about the legacy she'd inherited. I listened and tried to be the mother I'd never learned how to be, but the victory I'd thought I wanted felt hollow. I had set out to destroy my daughter and reclaim my rightful place in the world of wealth and power. Instead, I had destroyed myself and been saved only by the grace of the child I'd tried to ruin. The woman you've been listening to for the past 50 minutes isn't the same woman who discovered her husband's betrayal in that maid's room. That woman was bitter and desperate and consumed by a rage that ultimately consumed everything she touched. I am what's left after that rage burned itself out, smaller, sadder, but perhaps finally capable of something resembling wisdom. I never got my revenge, not really. Richard lives quietly in his condo, still wealthy enough but forever marked as the man who lost his inheritance through his own weakness. Sarah runs the business empire that should have been mine, but she does it better than I ever could have. And I live in my small house, working my small job, finally understanding that the life I'd always wanted was never really about money or power at all. It was about matching to someone. About being seen and valued and loved for who I was, not what I could provide or how well I could perform the role of wife or mother or society lady. I spent so many years trying to be perfect that I forgot how to be human, and by the time I remembered, I'd nearly destroyed the only person who might have loved me anyway. The inheritance I fought so hard to claim was never really about the money. It was about proving that I mattered, that my 23 years of suffering meant something, that I deserved more than the scraps I'd been offered. But the inheritance that actually mattered, Sarah's forgiveness. Her willingness to rebuild our relationship. Her grace in the face of my betrayal, that inheritance I almost threw away in my pursuit of revenge. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But I've learned that forgiveness is a dish that tastes better warm. Sarah served it to me when I deserved it least. And it saved what was left of my soul. If this story of betrayal, revenge, and redemption has touched you in any way, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support means everything to us as we continue to share these powerful stories of human resilience and the complicated bonds that hold families together, even when they seem broken beyond repair.